Brian Butler, of course, the soldier doesn't know whom to trust, but they also see these civilians hurting physically, emotionally. What kind of impact do you see it in your patients having had?
It has a huge impact on them in terms of the existential anxiety and the confusion they feel in trying to do the mission as well as they can. And at the same time, there's no clear-cut boundaries and there's no clear-cut enemy in terms of trying to distinguish them, the civilians, from the insurgents. So it does cause a lot of confusion, and it makes them incredibly hostile because you're in a hostile environment, and when you're in a chronic hostile environment, you tend to begin to see things with a hostile intent, and so you become hostile.
And the chronic nature of that hostile environment was something that one of the young soldiers talked about. And Heidi Kraft, just want to ask you about what he had to say. He said, well, you know, we have grenades going off and IEDs, and then we're told to go back and rest for 6 hours and then come back out again. And he said, we don't have the time to come down. You're always on with that heightened sense of alertness. You don't have time to rest. Is that actually physically true and psychologically true, that they don't get to come down?
It is absolutely true, most definitely. The level of arousal in which a person is placed in a situation like that is very, very high, and it is really difficult, both physiologically but especially emotionally, to actually have the recovery process from that level of arousal. 6 hours, it just isn't going to even start to do it. And yet, as I mentioned, the operational tempo a lot of times doesn't allow them what they really need, which is the time to completely what we call reset, allow their physiology and their emotional cognitive processes to return to normal and heal during that short period of time and in order to be able to go back.
And why is that important to have that resetting time?
Well, I think especially in this group that we watched in the clip, they were there for a very extended deployment, which was another thing that they complained about and had a difficult time with. So that we're talking here about two different things, a very acute and emergent sort of reaction to what's happening in the moment, which is really the fight or flight response, but also a chronic, ongoing, and relentless stress that they're up against day after day after day. So the two things layer over each other.
Brian Butler, what's your sense of what the body and mind need in the way of the intensity of the hostility and the protracted nature of it, to recover from that, to be ready to go back?
The concerns I have are the impact on the brain structures and the brain functioning. Long-term chronic exposure to trauma and potential trauma does have an impact on brain function. And there are some recent studies that show that it also has an impact on brain structure. There's a portion of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, and it is responsible for a lot of executive functions, things that you think about. It kind of is our logic center, if you will, to an extent. Research studies have shown that under prolonged chronic trauma and stress, the blood flow to the prefrontal cortex is diminished. There's another portion of the brain called the hippocampus, which other research studies have shown actually could possibly be shrinking in relation to the long-term chronic exposure to trauma, particularly in soldiers. So there's a concern with the impact on brain structure and function that chronic long-term exposure is causing, and in the short term, absolutely, in World War II and in Vietnam, they frequently would pull whole units out of the front line and give them, easily a week, sometimes even more, to kind of refit, process what they've gone through, grieve the loss of their friends and their comrades, and then kind of go back in after they've had a chance to calm down and relax. And those are the things that, if the operational tempo and the mission will allow, need to have happen, and I have no doubt the military is aware of that and are doing what they can to do that.
Heidi Kraft, the other quite horrible scene, of course, involved the taxi driver mistakenly shot and killed, and then the woman crying and saying he was just coming to pick me up for an appointment. Now again, what is the impact on soldiers of when something like this happens, when they're involved and responsible? How do they process that?
There are many things that people process later in the trauma. A lot of times these things are not processed in country during the mission, quite simply because you need to keep your blinders on and keep your head in the game, and don't allow yourself to go there to be able to do the healing work. But now, I'm sure Brian would agree, the people that I see now who have returned from combat and who are struggling with this process, one of the big themes that will emerge again and again is guilt of various types, guilt and shame, many times around the baseline moral and ethical conflicts of combat of any type. This particular conflict, as I had alluded to before, has this element of not knowing who the enemy is and not being able to trust anyone. And that's what happened with the taxi driver, as well as the old woman. These guys had a very distinct order that they were following, which is when they tell a car to stop, if it doesn't stop, their orders are clear because they have to assume that's the enemy. But I would expect that it's possible. Some of these guys may suffer from what we call sequelae of that later, and really they struggle with this idea of being a human who values human life, and being in a position like that, having to make that choice, and then having the guilt that they will live with later. It's oftentimes a part of the presentation of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Thank you so much, Brian Butler and Heidi Kraft. Thanks for being with us.